Let's go ahead and get this show on the road. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, note that this session is being recorded and we'll distribute the recording after the event. This conversation will be mostly driven by your questions. So on the right-hand side of your screen, just like where you've been dropping your location, you can click on that Q&A tab to ask some questions. We'll also be monitoring the chat as well, see if we can kick some of the questions from the chat over on into Q&A. I'm Patrick. I have the pleasure of leading our AI Inner Circle, Wonk Nations, which is our Slack community, and engaging with tons of customers, quorum users, and other public affairs pros to share a little bit about how they're leveling up their game. Also want to acknowledge Molly, who's in the back end of this webinar. You might see her name occasionally pop up. She's the real hero of this webinar. I might ask you to highlight some of your questions, and she might also be in the chat answering some of your stuff here as well. All right, let's go ahead and introduce our speakers. Today we are joined by two great senior leaders at We Communications. Gretchen Ramsey is the EVP, Head of Content and Creator at We Studios, and Charlie Baldwin is the Senior Vice President of Insights and Analytics at We Studios. Gretchen, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you to kick things off.
Awesome. Thanks for having us, and welcome to everyone on the call. We have been researching this new ecosystem of influence for quite some time, but for the past year, we've really dove deeply into understanding, doing some math and modeling around what's happening. And what we'll share with you today is some of the results of that. And hopefully it provides not only a perspective on what's going on, but some real tools and techniques for employing this in your work. The first thing to note is that the public affairs landscape is in revolution. Yes, things are changing, but it truly feels more like a revolt. There is so much action. Influence can seem unclear. The old folks that we used to talk to are no longer the ones gathering attention of the most important audiences. So we wanted to give some perspective in terms of like what that looks like in data. And a lot of this might be head nodding to you. You'll be like, yeah, I see this, but it's really quite compelling to see it in numbers. First, just know this is the golden age of innovation storytelling, and we're using the word innovation very widely and broadly. It is full of intersection points, especially with the work you all do in politics and things like global conflict and even other environments that are non-traditional innovation environments like entertainment and beauty and fashion. And we've seen a 6 times growth over the past 2 years in stories that have to do with innovation or the shifting or changing in our societal landscape. Simultaneously, we've seen this massive drop in engagement happening among those same stories, specifically for news and media outlets. And this is, again, a head nod, not a surprise that 4 in 10 people say they actively avoid news, sometimes or often. But there is really this dramatic 75% decrease in engagement happening with news, traditional news media. What's happening, rather, is this flocking to alternative news sources, a 14 times increase in engagement around these types of alternative sources. And when we say alternative, it includes things like social media, which I know doesn't necessarily feel new. It's been around for 20 years. But it is a space and place where everyone is going, and it is creating new patterns, new behaviors, which we'll talk about in a minute. So social media, newsletters, podcasts, that's what we mean by alternative sources. So you can see quite a dramatic shift in engagement away from our more legacy models. So the beautiful truth is that policy audiences are really craving these stories of innovation impact on society. And I know you're all probably working on these types of initiatives. The naked truth, however, is they don't like how we're telling these stories. The very innovation stories we're creating is actually shifting the way storytelling is being told. The landscape itself is shifting. And content that's breaking through is much more immersive and collaborative and visual, and a departure, perhaps, from the way we have been telling stories. The result is this rise of powerful new media entities. And some of these have been around for several years, but they're new. Like 2018 is new in the landscape of media. You look at the Bulwark, that's when they started in 2018. Breaking Points, another massive, new, very popular high engagement platform, this bipartisan podcast environment that is, critiquing and both from both sides of the aisle. But what we see here is this like massive volume of content being poured out by these new entities. Punchbowl, over the past year, a 250% increase in the amount of content and posts being shared. So the amount of content, again, back to this idea of revolt, the amount of content that is populating and flooding the internet is almost hard to get our hands around. But a lot of these new players have very distinct perspectives. Real America's Voice, for instance, a 9% increase in content creation over the past year. This is, a lot of Steve Bannon has a podcast on Real America's News that is quite popular. And you're seeing things like the Free Press. We all know what's happened over the past year in terms of the popularity of that. Still an independent entity, but the editorial environment around there really being shared in terms of the CBS more legacy ecosystem. So just like massive growth around these new entities. What's happening simultaneously is this anointing, if you will, of unexpected established media. So these tabloid style environments like the New York Post, the Daily Sun, and the Daily Mail are kind of creating these more sensationalistic environments around policy news. What's happening is really interesting with these tabloid style environments. New York Post had just announced that it's launching an initiative to create local entities of its publication. The US Sun has a super popular YouTube in the UK. They are launching that in the US as well and creating an entire digital ecosystem around that. Daily Mail has a very aggressive subscription initiative right now, again, looking for more localized content to fall out of that. But they really are kind of stripping down language and sensationalizing the way we're telling policy stories. So that's in terms of the structure of the content that's being created. These unexpected established media are shifting that. And then speaking of this local push, we see a lot of these local environments being very important, especially to some of the younger staffers or even policymakers that we're talking to. And Charlie and I are going to talk in depth about those influence environments. But in particular, we would just want to call out the way local news is being told. A fellow like Aaron Parness, who just sat down and had, if you follow him you should follow him on TikTok or Instagram. He does this kind of like walking through DC reporting style. He just sat down with Obama and had a lunch. I mean, very influential guy. I think he's 26 years old, perhaps. But really capturing the hearts and minds of these younger staffers. Same with CityCast DC. Maybe some of you also follow that, but also a lot of younger staffers kind of tracking and following along. Simultaneous to the shift in established media, creators are also redefining themselves. And no surprise, we see here, right in DC, you see the press briefing room has dramatically changed. They see themselves, these creators, literally sitting in the seats of journalists, and they're having a bit of an identity crisis, or an authenticity crisis, if you will. Is this really who I am? I'm a creator. Do I really want to be a journalist? Do I really want to follow the same principles that are in place? What are the ethical rules at play? There really is this really staggering shift that's happening, but also this true like ethos shift or emotional shift happening among creators. Their business is in flux. The way they've behaved is in flux. And there's this great quote from the Business Insider, in fact, where they say, no one knows how to define a podcast anymore, and it's become a problem. Are podcasters tubers? Are they talkers? Are they press room briefing stalwarts? What are they? And it's really difficult to use. Even the lexicon that we're using is in flux. The swim lanes no longer exist because it's not about who they are or where they sit, but the way the story is being told. And I started to kind of tease that idea a little bit earlier when I was talking about shorter, more soundbite relative content, the flooding of shorter content with bulleted lists and sensationalized headlines. This is happening, yes, because of the administrative environment, but it's also happening because of a massive generational push, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But today, the terms influencer, creator, storyteller, writer, even journalist are used interchangeably. So it becomes difficult for us as communicators, Charlie and I, to even frame them. And I'm sure for you in your communication environments to frame them. There are 27 million paid content creators in the US alone, according to the Wall Street Journal last year. I'm sure that number has increased. And when you think of the number of content creators that you interact with in your daily work, I'm sure it doesn't even come close to that. So just think of the depth of voice and variability that you have to influence your audiences. What this all requires is a new framework for planning and telling stories with influence. Again, back to the way we're telling being really important. We've created, as I said, Charlie and I, for the past year, dove very deeply into the math and modeling of this, and created a 6-step process, or 6 laws, if you will, for how to scale influence today. And I, understanding this works also on a very niche environment as well. But the first is to define your goals. And it's not like papering down 6 different things that you're trying to achieve. It's about strategy. And strategy is all about making choices. And that is singularly choosing one thing that you really want to do. Is it to increase market share, shift perception, or drive new constituents to your idea? That really, you need to be singular about what you're trying to do. The second is to identify the audience. And I know this seems obvious, but often we talk in broad sweeps about audience, and audiences are not a monolith. Generations are not a monolith. You have to get very segmented in who you're talking about and who you need to talk to. And then the third is to place them within their own cultural context. And you have to get like hyper niche about this. And sometimes I see people from all over the country here in the chat. Sometimes it's very specific what's going on in their neck of the woods that would impact the way they would respond to your message or your story or your need. And then fourth is to identify what we call influence heroes. And heroes, we see them in the data. These are the people that have an incredible amount of gravity and weight in the content that they share, and they have speed also in the content that they share. It moves very quickly, and they have not only credibility, but the ability to sway opinion. So influence heroes, you need to identify exactly who these are. They could be 2 people, they could be 200 people. And then the fifth is to choreograph the story. And Charlie is going to talk a lot about this, but this is about layering the playing field. You can't just think about influence singularly, like one particular channel or one particular outlet. It is a concerted, choreographed effort of many different voices and many different channels working together to create that. And we have some modeling against that. And owned is super important. Charlie additionally has been doing a lot of work around GEO, the new SEO, generative engine optimization, where owned is hyper important in your influence model. And then sixth, and this is, last in our list, but not least. In fact, it is just the beginning. When you lay out an idea into the world, when you put an idea into a market, it is just the beginning. The minute you announce some news, you're not done. You are just beginning. Content, news, information sharing is happening in the comments, especially on hyper comment-centered environments, like some of these smaller forums we mentioned earlier, or newsletter commentary, in particular on YouTube and TikTok. There is a ton of information, Reddit as well, a ton of information sharing that you're responsible for as communicators once your idea hits market. So what does it look like when we take these 6 laws and start to visualize what influence looks like? This is what we call the influence swell. And the influence swell is this choreographed, interdependent ecosystem of channels that I just mentioned. And oftentimes we think about, I need to get this idea out. I need to announce this, or I need to create this press release, or I need to tell this one person or this one entity. And it kind of typically looks like a sharp increase and a sharp decrease influence. But when it's orchestrated, when it's choreographed well, it looks like a swell, like a proper rounded wave, and it has these beautiful shoulders of influence that exist beyond your major momentum. It begins with social provocation, and it's happening now already. I swear to you, even if you think it's something new that no one's ever heard about, in Substack, in Reddit, people are already talking about your idea, and you need to be there to help foster and influence that. It then begins to shift into community discussion, broader, more mainstream, if you will, social environments. So out of these like hyper niche form social environments into places like TikTok and YouTube, as I mentioned earlier. And then it moves and shifts into digital news. And this is typically where traditional communicators enter. And often those earlier phases are skipped. But this is when you lift an embargo or you announce something. Industry press has a lot of weight here. And we start to kind of the story starts to take off, momentum starts to build. Then that it explodes into this mainstream social conversation, and you start to see these other mainstream environments taking over. Again, TikTok, YouTube being predominant, Facebook in certain instances, especially around millennials, and we'll get to that in a minute, really important. And then only then do we shift into broadcast conversation, where you have some of these like more mainstream ABC News, NBC here in the States, BBC News, that kind of thing, tracking broadcast content, and localization of that content starts to happen. Then we have cultural commentary, parodies, memes, pushback, all of this deep opinion posts and podcasters discussing all this cultural commentary happens here on the denouement of the swell. And then finally, long form response, these very deep industry commentary happening here. Analysts get involved. We have places like the Atlantic and the New Yorker doing long form analyses, the Times kind of doing series and extrapolations on the idea. So this is how it works, and you can control this. We are using this as a planning mechanism in the influence work that we're doing. And then Charlie's going to talk and show you some specific examples of what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, and so probably good to start with a bit of of grounding that I am the data perspective to some extent on this. So what you'll see now is taking some of these models and applying them, making them really applicable and real in stories that we as an agency have supported and in just really broadly studying moment. So we're going to start with a moment that maybe some of you read about, which was a massive development in science and technology when Microsoft in February of this year announced a large quantum discovery. They essentially, what was really picked up was the concept that they had in many ways created a new state of matter. Which obviously was quite a breaking news moment to change science in that way. But what we wanted to truly understand with this exercise was how could we choreograph the story and to build as much influence and as much balanced, but obviously really constructive discussion and attention around this key moment. So we started with, as Gretchen said, an understanding of the social provocation. And it turns out that some of the specific elements of discovery and of innovation that Microsoft announced on this day, February 19th, were actively being discussed, hotly debated in subreddits and on X and among the wonk scientific community on YouTube. So there was a baseline of conversation that we were seeking to tap into. And so what we tried to do was not really make it so much of a aha, this is pulling the curtain back, but really a tapping into an existing cultural conversation, albeit a very focused and expert one. But the way that this was approached was through multiple spheres of influence. So we tried to make sure that we had a very significant embargo-driven reveal moment that was highly orbiting around digital news, around the most authoritative sources of information, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, those top tier outlets. But we know that not everybody, as we've talked about, not everybody is looking at those for news. Not everyone, in fact, we see a real decrease in individuals who are sourcing their news from those places. So we also went out with a huge creator and social driven activation here, as well as an owned content push, knowing that would bring something different and allow our clients to really lead with the facts and their own perspective. But what this all led to was a broad-shouldered moment, as Gretchen said. The idea of the swell is you try to avoid a single peak, right? No one is looking for their news to be a flash in the pan. They want it to be something that has sustained momentum, that stays in people's minds, that's memorable, and that kind of that moves fluidly through different ecosystems and through different audience perspectives. So again, as you look at how this swell developed, we have a lot of social discussion as the creator content hit the internet and hit our devices, but also as conversation started to occur and healthy debate about what does this mean for quantum computing, for the future of technology, for how we teach science, for all kinds of things. And this is where that insider perspective and having a little bit more of a deeper conversation became really important, right? A podcast interview with Satya, with one of the CEO of Microsoft, with one of the most influential technology podcast hosts, Dwarkesh, as well as a number of other creators. And as we moved into the later parts of the day and into the days following, this is where broadcast began to pick up and drive local conversation. This is where print came in. and cultural commentary, things like ending up in the New York Times news quiz or late night shows, or things that demonstrate that this has broken through into culture. So obviously not everybody is announcing a new state of matter when they have news. So we know that it's not always possible to get to that level, but there are things we can learn about how this works. And there are elements that are useful to carry through when you're planning your news, when you're trying to land your public affairs narratives. So really important in our mind to identify in advance of a moment, who are your top igniters? Who's going to help you get that story and light it on fire in a good way? Get it out there, right? For us, for this moment, it was Forbes, it was New York Times, it was The Verge, some of these embargoed parties, but also it was creators who we knew had a lot of heat around them for this kind of information, and whose audiences have very strong affinity for them. And then but we also, as we've said, the moment needs to last. It needs to be memorable. And with how quickly news moves, you need extenders too. So we, in some cases, identified them. In some cases, the extenders emerged through natural discourse, which was really fascinating to witness. But lining up a Bloomberg or a Wall Street Journal to write a follow-up piece in the days to follow, or having that podcast where there was more of an insider interview and discussion land later, helped us to get that extension. Gretchen, do you want to?
Sure, I can take this.
Through sort of the generational.
Yeah. So the most important thing to remember here, beyond this idea of choreographing that Charlie was just talking through, is that diversity is needed. When we looked at how to influence mass audiences, we looked a million ways at how to break things down. What are the differences in audience behavior? What is the core? Are they psychographic? Is it demographic? We kept coming back to this one observation that, in fact, yes, life stage has everything to do with how people consume information. And trust me, we didn't want to do this. We had all kinds of different mappings, but it's just too dramatic. And so what you can see here in this chart is a breakdown of consumption behaviors around information. And the darkest blues are the older generations, and the green and lighter blue are the younger generations, Gen Z and millennials. Obviously, again, no surprise, TV dramatically popular among boomers and their counterparts in Gen X. And this is not a surprising observation. And you can see social media trending much higher for the younger generations, obvious. What we didn't expect to see, some anomalies in this data, is the interest in podcasting among millennials and even Gen Z. We're starting to see an increase in Gen Z consumption of podcasting as well. And you can see that here. It's the second from the right collection of bars. Podcasting. That was surprising to us, and we needed to investigate why that's happening, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Similarly, digital newsletters, the importance of repetitive, consistent content from the same voice coming straight to you in your inbox or in your feed, but being a subscriber being actually very important for younger generations. Also an anomaly. Older generations are here across the board. There is, especially in the way they're consuming digital news, there's not that much of a divergence here. So also a surprise to us. So we want to dive a little bit deeper with you into the behaviors around each of these life stages. And so we looked generationally at these specific 4 quadrants: Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and boomers. And what we're seeing is that there is, for Gen Z, this desire for relatability, if you will, intersectionality, multiple perspectives, really understanding, they take a more passive approach to news and are gathering their news actually outside of policy news, finding them, or policy circles. But they're looking for some equal stock in various news streams. They're really looking for these multiple perspectives. Where millennials, yes, also are seeking that balance, but are much interested in more in-depth discussion. Their younger counterparts are interested in shorter, even animated explainers, that kind of thing. Not so for the millennials. While that's, some of the content they consume, they're diving very deeply into understanding. They're looking, as I said, these podcast discussions, longer form YouTube videos, even documentaries about topics. They're very much interested in what's happening in the comments, and they have the highest participation rates there. Again, in-depth discussion would be the core behavior for them. Gen X is looking for also discovery and credibility with their content, similar to their millennial partners, especially for younger Gen X. They're interested in deeper discussion, but it is more self-directed discovery. So as I mentioned, these YouTube documentaries, long form, hour-long documentaries about topics, they are watching all the way through. They have a higher incidence of TV, obviously, and that bleeds over into their social behaviors. They are interested in really learning things deeply, sitting with podcasts that have not only this depth of discussion, but maybe even some entertainment value based on the legacy of their content consumption behavior. So think of like podcasts like Smartless, for instance. Where boomers are looking for opinion and validation, and their behaviors are much closer in, where all the way the other side of the spectrum, Gen Z is looking more for more globality and intersectionality. Boomers are looking rather for more localization and validation of people with opinions like their own. So gosh, when you start to think about this generationally, and you're like, oh, I have an idea or something I want to put out into the world, a story. One size does not fit all. And you really need to cater the story for these 4 different behaviors. When we start to look at the content expectations against this behavior, we start to see that Gen Z is much more interested in these global voices, video documentary style and animation, as I mentioned earlier, social justice always at the center, and other voices, alternative voices outside of policy environments. They're not coming, as we talked about, to news environments for their news. Millennials are looking for trusted creators, mainstream news for sure, but with new voices or alternative voices. Video conversations, I would say, are the most important thing for them, and podcast conversations that have video piggybacking with it. Gen X, their content expectations are established and new voices, both. Again, discovery being a core behavior. They want to hear new things, but they are all investigative and research-based. So positioning your story in that kind of frame, explainer, and deep understanding context. For boomers, their expectation is legacy media voices, start and stop, primarily closer to home or closer to their own interests. Creators who are like them. It's not that they're eschewing creators or new voices, but those creators have to be like them and have to look and feel like them and have the same cultural context that they have. Forums for discussion, also opinionated discussion for this group. So we created another tool for you, and that tool is called an influence map, and it takes all of that information, places it in one singular view. And these tools are used as decision tools, the things that are closest in or most influential, and concentrically moves outward in influence from there. Everything that makes the map is influential. And I'm not going to go through these in full detail. We don't have enough time for that, but I will kind of click on a few things. For Gen Z, please note that both social channels, TikTok and YouTube, are imperatives for them in terms of influence, but creators who have, again, intersectionality, I think you'll probably be surprised to see Taylor Swift on a policy influence map, but she has so much political content in her language and her posts and the way she behaves in the world that she is a core influence. But then you see other things here like BBC News, a legacy media house that has great digital legs that they follow. So just know that there is a lot more globality in their influence. Punchbowl making the mark here on their map, Al Jazeera as well, Vice News, some of the more traditional stalwarts that have this intersectionality framing.
Gretchen, I would just add, like, Mr. Beast, for example, too, is an example of a creator who began as sort of still very high levity, but he and his organization have been hugely influential in things like cleaning up oceans and water conservation and a number of these more issues-oriented things. So this is why it might seem odd to put him on a map like this, but him and others like him are getting involved and are influential in questions of policy.
Yeah, that's great. And that's exactly the point, that the lanes are gone, as we said earlier. For millennials, you'll start to see some closer association or the mapping of influence with NPR and CNN and BBC News much closer in than their younger counterparts. But you still see heavy YouTube behaviors from this group as well. You start to see something interesting about brand followership here, NASA appearing on their framing. Also, I want to point out breaking points, which I mentioned earlier, a lot of millennial interest around that podcast. For Gen X, again, the most influential content for them is coming from, I did want to point out, there are Facebook behaviors, I'm not seeing it on this map, for millennials, especially when we think globally, when there's like state-run media, really high Facebook behaviors for millennials, but we also see it with Gen X. No surprise, they kind of founded and grew that platform, but it is where they get a lot of their information and news. Also, more of the traditional news outlets, but again, BBC News appearing here. So if you take one thing away from these maps, you should be talking to BBC News when you're announcing things. For boomers, again, more localized content appearing in the influence. So local versions of ABC News, CBS, these more legacy or established media environments, Fox News. But we're also seeing we do see influencers, but again, it's people they know and they've kind of recognized throughout their lives. Even people like Martha Stewart. Obviously, you see Sanjay Gupta here, similar in vein to Martha Stewart, and some of the like Biden, some of the presidential or political luminaries that they have grown up with, frankly. So influence is about intimacy, and we created these maps to kind of use them as a tool for intimacy. And what we mean by intimacy is just getting closer to the people that you're trying to influence. And how you tell stories allows you to get closer to them. The framing and structure of content is very important. Again, this is another tool, and all of this we're sending along to you, but to think about how you're telling stories, just to orient you, this bar across the center, expression, explaining, and understanding, are storytelling frameworks that these generational cohorts react to. And we organize voices of influence by interest, not type. So we wouldn't say, oh, we need to talk to some YouTubers or we need to talk to some podcasters. Again, these are typically multi-channel, multimedia environments. But rather, we start to think about the storytelling frame. Do we need to express something? Do we need to explain it? Do we need to have people understand deeply something hard to understand that has a lot of complexity? And then we start to align with influencers, that's both traditional media and new voices, new power voices, or creators or educators, whatever it might be, around that. So if understanding, for instance, is what we're trying to alight among our cohorts, we would go to like education and learning creators or influencers, science influencers, technology influencers. If we need to explain something in further detail, we would go to these interest areas that have the ability to explain things very well, like business and legal and finance, society or culture experts. Even health and wellness sits in this explaining environment, and you can just think about your own feed in that realm. Then when we start to go into expression, that's when you start to see lifestyle, entertainment and gaming, art and design and writing, the obvious expressives in our society. However, it doesn't mean that you need to sit in one of these areas. We use these, we sometimes have all three territories in the way we're telling stories, depending on how and what we need to communicate. But again, another tool, another way to think about influence by interest type.
So if we go back to one of the first things we said, which is that influence is coming from all over, many different ecosystems, many different places. How, as communicators, as public affairs professionals, can we decide and identify who are our heroes of influence for a particular story we want to tell? So what we did is tried to look at the scholarly work that has been done over the last few decades around what does influence mean in different situations, in different industries, as well as bring our perspective of navigating this for many clients and across many sectors. What are the elements of influence? And this is a cross-cutting set of dimensions that it doesn't matter if you're a podcaster or a journalist or a YouTuber, these hold true. And so what you ultimately need in our eyes is you need credibility, which is trustworthiness, proven authority. You need heat, which is some level of provocation, of interest, of virality, is the term du jour on the internet, but it's not always on the internet that heat exists. Reach is about the size, the scope, the diversity of the channels that your heroes access and influence, and affinity, which is that two-way connection between a target audience, the audience of a given influencer, and then that influencer's affinity to a topic or story that we're trying to tell. And what these ultimately can help you do is look at influencers not based on the channel that they come from, but based on their art and science, so qualitative and quantitative scoring of each of these dimensions. And the critical thing here is that this is not a leaderboard for all things AI or for all things education. You have to pick a focus area like education or energy conservation or something, and then you have to pick an audience. Because if you really think about it, the influence and each of these dimensions change depending on the audience you're trying to reach and the story or the topic you're trying to influence. So Lex Fridman, who does his 3-hour mega podcasts where he goes really deep in interviewing, that might be more relevant and more helpful and more interesting to someone who is a developer or someone who really wants to get inside those kinds of conversations. Whereas, someone like Ross or Matt Walsh, it's going to be more relatively shorter form. It's going to be print primarily, but you have a different audience who might be interested in that kind of thing. So I think what we're doing here is creating a place where you're comparing and building a chorus of voices in a way that is agnostic of channel, agnostic of the traditional ways that you bucket people, and more thinking about, for the given moment that we're in, the story we want to tell, the credibility that we have, who are the right people to corral and to bring into that conversation and to help carry that story and carry that narrative.
Awesome. So that's a lot of content and frameworks, but it is, as Charlie said, very scientific and grounded. Then what happens when you're trying to create experiences? Once you've selected these people and you've made sure that they are appropriate for your story, it's all about access, and access means something very different now. And we have these 5 different access territories that we work to engage with every new story we're introducing. The first is access to raw content that meets these new creators or these new influencers' edit needs. And that means shorts, versioned assets, graphics, moving away from the traditional, I need some B-roll and a still. That is, those are the days of yesteryear. Now we need to create an asset library of shorts that are well conditioned and quick and easy to capture because the content is being created on the fly. Second is access to tactile environments. So we do things like bring them into research labs, or give them products to hold, or hands-on tactile things that they can, remember, they typically are creating in visual mediums. Even in the podcast, they are, remember, very visual as well. Third is access to people. Executives, researchers, insiders, anyone who is aligned to your story that they might not have access to otherwise. Very important. Access to a space to edit. If you are on site with them, or they have come to visit you, or you are hosting an event, for instance, you have to have a quiet space where they can edit because they want to turn around their content either live or immediately after they've created it. And then fifth is access to equipment. You should build a gear library and carry it with you. It can be a little, case of additional windscreens or batteries or whatever it might be. Or if you're doing a big event, have a proper gear library room that could include everything from cameras to computers for editing. As we kind of move forward into thinking about what does access look like, Charlie talked a little bit about the quantum Majorana moment earlier, and we wanted to show you exactly what it looks like when you kind of orchestrate that way with these new voices. These are all unpaid influencers that we brought to a secret research lab on Microsoft's campus to literally play with the new chip, the new Majorana quantum chip, and understand this new state of matter. We put them with researchers, and this is the result. And we didn't even ask them to do this, but it was just like this repetitive image. And so this well-concerted, choreographed approach and access in this manner leads to that. Okay. In summary, I want time for questions. You need to make sure that you think first about the communications problem, what you're trying to do, not where you want to tell your story. Second, you need to make sure that you think about those behavioral storytelling needs, intersectionality, discussion, discovery, and opinion. And then third, you need to tell all 4 of those things. And then third, you need these new voices. Find these new voices, even in established media, to talk to. And fifth, make sure that you are creating visual and audio assets with all the stories you're creating. And finally, participate in the story. It happens in the comments. So be there, and don't just introduce an idea and let it lay on the internet. You have to be participatory and answer questions, which is what we're going to do right now. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, y'all. And we got a bunch of great questions in the Q&A tab. If you haven't yet asked your question, go on over there to the Q&A. Also, there's an upvote feature. So we'll be asking the questions that get the most upvotes, but there's one that stuck with me that I really wanted to ask here from Stephen, which is, love the Swell approach. I use the Swell metaphor to reduce peaks and valleys. Another way I think of this is, how do we swell or rise to a new plateau, if that makes sense. So my question is, have you seen the best practices as to how to use swells to reach and sustain engagement closer to peak and not drop off to the pre-swell plateau?
Yeah, we have a partner on this work that actually is using the word maintainer to connect the swell. So, good influence kind of looks like this undulating wave. It shouldn't look like sharp peaks. And what happens between those waves is that sustained moment that you're talking about. And these are maintainers, and relationship being the most important thing. You have to have relationships now and build relationships now. So then when you need them most, I mean, public policy, public affairs is a very volatile environment. You need those relationships now so that you can employ them when you need them most.
Right. That's fantastic. So it's like a group of folks that you identify. These are our maintainers. These are the folks that will continually leverage over time.
Yeah. And there are ways to do it. And this is, through an earned environment, but you could also do it from a paid environment where you're like contracting for a year or several years with different voices, depending on what you're communicating.
That's great. Another question came up. How do I get these provocateurs, which is a word I use all the time, but I like it. These provocateurs to start talking about our work.
And those provocateurs could even be people within your own organization. I would make sure that they are credible and part of the community already. But think about, I don't know, some complex scientific narrative, and you have a researcher from your organization participating in a Reddit thread to clarify or qualify or even tease some of the work that you're doing. It does feel a little bit like a tease environment, but it is also just, again, building relationships and depth of understanding, and they can be your own people. However, if it's not, you actually, as Charlie mentioned earlier, we identify people that are highly active in here, and we score and rank them, and create relationships and partnerships with them, give them access, as I mentioned, to the idea, early access under embargo, take them to your lab, take them to your office, have a sit down with your leaders, that kind of thing, but build that relationship and then set them free.
Yeah, the thing I would add is that their audiences flock to them because they trust that influencer will always speak to them authentically as themselves. So if you have a story to tell, the hardest thing you can do is try to make your story be the story. It needs to dock into the way that this influencer speaks, the way that they authentically, so you have to sort of let them run with it, let them have their perspective, let them take it in the direction that they think makes the most sense, and trust and be a partner there. That's how you get the provocative angles, but ones that are still going to ultimately carry the story forward.
Yeah. And well, provocative, right? So really curious what your advice is on maintaining brand safety and, making sure that the folks that you're reaching out to are provocative in the right way versus, you hate to work with somebody who ends up going off the rails a little bit 2 or so weeks after the campaign. So I'm curious what your thoughts are there around finding the right kind of provocative.
Yeah, and part of the reason we created this influence index scoring model, and it is based on influence science, is to protect the brands and honor brand safety. But we have a very deep vetting process as well, which we haven't shared here. But that it is important to, again, I keep using the word relationship, but understand over a length of time how a person behaves, so you can predict and even model what they will do for you. And there are ways to do that, through data scientifically. Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Having let's look at their history. Let's not just pick, the person we heard about yesterday.
Oh, yes, indeed.
All right. Given the decrease of legacy media consumptions, do you still see media relations practitioners still being, needed? Perhaps the work might look a little bit different. What do you think this is going to look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of these skills, I mean, we work in the communications industry, which is also in a bit of an evolution, and the skills of legacy media relations practitioners are very much needed in this new model. Critical thinking, relationship building, the truisms still exist. In fact, there's such beautiful nuance that exists among this. I mean, I'm sure you all know, or maybe are, these like veteran media relations folks that have just an incredible ability to build trust with a voice or even a new creator, that those are entirely transferable to these new environments. What is different is the speed at which the content is moving, and the volumetrics, as I mentioned earlier, around that content. So it is almost like an interplay between these existing foundational skills and these new skills.
Yeah, and I would add that as much as things are changing, I don't think that we see any decrease in the importance of having authority sources. So creators are often repurposing and turning back, pulling out and referencing traditional or established media, pointing to them. We actually look to see, because this hypothesis comes up a lot, we look to see how much of the social conversation in the first hour of that quantum moment was driven by, in some way, sharing of news or sharing of articles. And it was I think it was around 30 to 40%. So it's a real igniter of the conversation. And we don't know what that swell would have looked like if we hadn't had that big news moment. So I really don't think it's about shifting away from traditional at all. I think it's consumption patterns are changing. We need to be aware of those. We need to expand our thinking on how we tell stories, but these are still highly valued sources of information, and ultimately almost sometimes start the flywheel.
Yeah. Let's go through one last question here, which is just how long does it take for us to move through a full swell?
Yeah, I think it's how long is a piece of string. Like you can plan and manage something in 2 hours or 2 months. A swell can exist for as long as the motion exists. And we have the Majorana, I can't remember exactly the dates on that quantum swell you shared, Charlie, but 2 weeks. Okay. So that was 2 weeks. But you can, we have actually seen them, months long. We have seen them also much shorter, like reactive kind of cycles that could be, hours long. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's about, back to the concept of rules, right? It's about, if you're planning a moment, just consider all the things that you're needed. So even if it's you're only anticipating it being a couple days, make sure it's not a couple hours, right? It's just always be thinking about, how do I tell a full surround sound story? And ultimately, it doesn't matter if it's 3 weeks, 3 months, you just want it to look like that shape, because that shape will tell you that you have choreographed things and that you've considered all the different ways that stories are consumed.
And that you're reaching the broadest audiences as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Our webinar platform is saying we got 19 seconds left. So I wanted to use that 19 seconds to thank you so much, Charlie and Gretchen, for joining us. This was an incredible presentation. And thank you to everybody in the chat who is joining us here today. We'll be sending the recording in the next day or two, so please keep an eye out. And cannot wait to see you all at our next Quorum webinar. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Patrick.